Good afternoon. Welcome back to our 10th annual Sacred Trust History Talks and Book Signings event presented by the Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park. My name is Brooke Diaz and I'm with the Gettysburg Foundation. The Gettysburg Foundation is the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service here at Gettysburg. And over the years, as we've presented Sacred Trust, we've been pleased to invite renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park Service rangers, and licensed battlefield guides so that they can share their unique perspectives on the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg with you, our visitors. And this year is no exception. However, we are expanding in a really exciting way. We're actually live streaming all of our Sacred Trust talks to our website for those who can't be here on site with us. So if you have any friends and family who haven't been able to make it here today, or if you're not able to make it back the next 2 days, visit our website at www.gettysburgfoundation.org/Sacred Trust. And we look forward to seeing you there. You can also ask your questions to the authors in real time. Now I'd like to introduce our first topic this afternoon. William Marvel will present Gettysburg and the Road to Andersonville. Much of the bitterness that lingered after Appomattox worsened the misery of those held prisoner, and at Andersonville became a propaganda tool for sustaining partisan hatred, even after the shooting had stopped. Some of that bitterness survives into the present as the proponents of simplistic interpretations cling to the competing myths that might be dispelled on closer examination. William Marvel is a freelance writer since 1980, specializing in nonfiction, historical nonfiction, primarily related to the American Civil War. He's the author of 15 books and numerous papers and articles, and in 1995, in recognition of his great historical works, Marvel was awarded the Lincoln Prize at Gettysburg College, the Douglas Southall Freeman Award, and the Malcolm and Muriel Barrow Bell Award. I'd like for you all to join me in welcoming William Marvel.
Thank you. I have to remember that I have a microphone on me. I think there's some tape on my back. That's not a spot for a sharpshooter. That's supposed to hold the wire in place. I always have trouble with these microphones, particularly this kind that you can carry around with you, even if it's in a stand. It tends to remind me of an incident back in the about 1970 when I fought my way to the front of a Tina Turner concert, and she was performing a rendition of Proud Mary with the microphone, using it rather vigorously. And every time I get near one of these things, I kind of lose my train of thought. So I'll stand over here. I should warn you that I'm rather skeptical about much of the material that I research, and I've kind of developed a reputation for being cynical about whatever particular topic I take up. When I was writing about Appomattox, I was criticized for being derogatory of Confederate soldiers and a Union advocate. And when I wrote about Andersonville, I was called a neo-Confederate, an apologist for the Confederacy. And I'm just an equal opportunity cynic. I thought I would start with this photograph, which you've seen if you've been over in the National Cemetery. It's the picture of Lincoln. They think it's Lincoln, at least, near the center, toward the top, sitting down apparently, or he would be taller than everyone else. He's either just finished delivering the Gettysburg Address or is just thinking about it. I don't know that anyone knows which is the case. What he was going to talk about is the unfinished work that lay before them, the work of the people who had fought at Gettysburg. the great task remaining, as it were. Well, what was he talking about? As you heard a couple of speakers ago, there are competing narratives of Civil War history, sometimes conflicting narratives. The modern narrative would be that he was thinking about emancipation, finishing up emancipation. The older narrative would be he was thinking about reuniting the country. He was a good enough politician, I think, that he remained ambiguous deliberately so that he could attract adherents for either aim, and perhaps both affected him equally. The situation in November of 1863 was not unlike what Alan Guelzo was describing in August of 1864, perhaps not as intense, but it was not the atmosphere of victory that we always imagine after the Battle of Gettysburg. You kind of race through Civil War history, and all of a sudden on July 3rd and 4th you have the victory at Gettysburg, the victory at Vicksburg, and after that it seems like a downhill road. In truth, the army that Meade had defeated at Gettysburg had recovered by September and October of 1863 enough that it forced Meade into a hasty retreat toward Washington. And that was after the Confederate Army had been reduced by detachments to the army in Tennessee. And in Tennessee, as Lincoln was speaking, the Union Army was under siege at Chattanooga still. And this was after having been defeated about 2 months before Lincoln spoke at the Battle of Chickamauga, defeated significantly, chased from the field by an army that it had never failed to defeat before. So Lincoln was, well, he wasn't really saying mission accomplished by any sense, but he was sort of saying stay the course, which we have heard before too. I think he was hoping to recover the lost support of the previous summer that included the introduction of the draft and the riots that followed that, and dissatisfaction generally among a population that was largely, not a majority of it, but largely not supportive of the war. A significant number of Americans were still not in support of the war, in fact, more than probably in 1862. The unfinished work that Lincoln spoke of was finished here for many of the soldiers in the Union Army. The task that he spoke of required a lot more suffering, a lot more death, and ultimately a lot more animosity was engendered between the regions of the nation. The exchange program between prisoners, North and South, had already broken down when Lincoln was speaking, and on the very week that he spoke, the Confederate authorities began looking for someplace else to put Union prisoners than Richmond. The capital of the Confederacy was bursting at the seams with prisoners. It was difficult to feed them because there were so many refugees, Southern refugees in the capital, and bureaucrats, as there always are in capitals. And so they wanted to get them out for both logistical and security reasons. The picture you see here is taken about 1868, but that's Anderson Station on the Southwestern Railroad between Macon and Columbus, Georgia. It's about 50 miles from Macon and about 10 miles from Americus, if you know where that is. The railroad offered a spot where supplies could be brought easily to the prisoners, and there was relative security at that time. There was no Union Army within reach of this area. And the warehouses that you see there are Confederate warehouses built to hold some of the warehouses that held the rations for the prisoners there. That track that the road that goes over the railroad track there, led to the prison. This is the same scene from the other direction. I took that around 1991. No longer a Confederate warehouse there. I don't think it's even in use anymore then, but at least the railroad was running then. This is literally the road to Andersonville. After you cross the railroad tracks, you would take this road down to a T intersection that you can see in the left background. And if you took the road to the left, you would go to the guard camps. If you took the road to the right, you would wind around to the Star Fort, where the Commandant of the stockade kept his headquarters. And you can see the stockade itself in the distance there. That's actually the outer stockade you're looking at, which was built after the main prison, but the bullpen, so-called, is inside it. Fairly desolate area, as you can see. It doesn't grow much except pine trees and black oak, jack oak, really. And those pine trees were largely cut down to build the stockade. The photographs of the prison seem to be somewhat reversed in my last version of this, but we'll start here. This is the north gate of the stockade. You'll notice there's no shelter in the prison except for the blankets and tents that people have of their own. The building in the background is the sutler's structure. The sutler would sell goodies, vegetables, canned foods, watermelon, whatever was available to those who had money. The sutler at Andersonville was a Confederate, formerly an officer, and now essentially a concessionaire inside the prison. There was later a good deal of opprobrium cast on him because he was taking advantage of the prisoners and overcharging them for what he sold them, which is, from my recollection of being in the Army, is not an unusual thing. That was done when I was in basic training, and apparently was done during the Civil War as well. You can see more of the stockade wall in the background, the far stockade wall. These men are not terribly well dressed, as you can see, but neither are they naked. There were a lot of memoirs after the war talking about Union soldiers walking around with no clothes on, dressed in rags, and I don't doubt that some were, but it was not it was more common for them to have clothing and to have some sort of shelter of their own. There were no barracks built at Andersonville until about August of 1864, and it opened up in February. So for most of the prisoners who were there, they were on their own for shelter. Here's a picture of taken on the north wall of the stockade. This is unusual because there's an open street, more or less, that you can see between the tents. The scantling fence you see on the left is the so-called deadline, beyond which prisoners were not to tread. It had a dual purpose. One was to keep people from scaling the stockade wall at night if they could fashion a rope, and it, even more importantly, discouraged tunneling because it added distance to any tunnel you would have to dig. There are, again, many stories of men tunneling a long way to get out of the prison. I tend to doubt those because if you've ever, when I was working on a story about the Battle of the Crater, I learned that you can only go 150, 200 feet into the earth directly before you run out of oxygen. You have to ventilate that tunnel somehow, and that was virtually impossible. But it was possible to dig your way out from somewhere along the deadline. There were claims after the war that anyone who put his hand on the deadline would be shot dead. And those were the rules. You could not pass beyond the deadline. I don't know about touching it, but you can see they've tied their tents to it. That can't really be true. And the fact is there were very few people shot inside the deadline, although many walked inside it, often on a suicidal mission, and were ultimately chased out. A couple were killed who were evidently trying to commit suicide, and a total of 11 prisoners I found were actually shot inside the stockade in Andersonville by guards and killed. Probably another 8, 9, maybe 10 were wounded and survived, at least survived their wounds. After the war, when they were prosecuting the commandant of the stockade, the prosecutor brought forward evidence that 149 Union prisoners died of wounds at Andersonville. They used the Latin term, vulneus sclopeticum. Don't ask me what that means. My Latin didn't get that far as a freshman in high school, but it ultimately translates into gunshot wound. That prosecutor just kind of arbitrarily said that there were so many reports of men killed that it must have been twice that many. So the term 300 has often been used for the number of prisoners who were shot by guards at Andersonville. The truth is that the majority of the men who died of gunshot wounds at Andersonville, 137 of them, died of wounds that they received on the battlefield. They were wounded when they were captured. They came to Andersonville, wounded, went into the hospital, and died. But the deadline, nevertheless, was depicted as a diabolical structure placed there to give guards an excuse to kill prisoners. There were, as no one mentioned during the trial of the commandant, there were deadlines inside Union prisons as well. And I found at least 33 Confederate prisoners who were shot by guards in Union prisons, some of them with obvious malice. One Union surgeon complained that a guard in St. Louis fired at a patient he was working on and killed the patient and wounded the man beside him for no reason that the surgeon could understand. Here is the south side of the prison. The photographer, A.J. Riddle, a Georgian, came down on August 16th, 1864, and took all of these pictures of the stockade and other things around Andersonville. And at this point, he is on a guard roost just north of Stockade Creek. There was a creek that ran directly through the prison. That was another reason for placing the prison there. That way the prisoners could have water. They would use the upstream end of it for drinking and cooking, the central portion of it for bathing and washing their clothes, and the lower end for the latrines. And that's what you're looking at there. Those are the latrines in use. The so-called raiders at Andersonville, Union prisoners who victimized their fellow prisoners in order to survive, lived on the south side of the prison. Their encampment would have been toward the right of this picture, but it wouldn't have been there when this picture was taken because they had been broken up at the end of June by a vigilante force of prisoners whom the camp commandant had armed with clubs and abetted with armed guards. Most of the raiders had been taken out. 6 of them were brought back in and hanged. Others were punished outside the prison by juries composed of other prisoners. So that portion, their little encampment was gone. It would have looked like a little empire in Shantytown there, were it there. This is taken from the other side of the creek. You can see the extent of the creek and the drainage coming down the hill on the right. This, again, it was taken August 16th. On August 9th, there had been a flash storm at Andersonville, creating such a flood that the stockade logs along the creek washed down. And the guards had to be trotted out in the rainstorm to encircle the rupture in the stockade wall, but no one tried to escape. Most of them were in their tents trying to keep out of the deluge. and many of them, of course, were either too weak or too sick to try to run, and the rest of them just didn't know about it. The so-called island at Andersonville is right there in the center of the photograph. It's surrounded by water on two sides and by mud on the other sides. There is a, I don't know if I have it in here, but there is a picture elsewhere of, and this isn't it, of a soldier trying to trench around his tent on the island. The prison consisted originally of 16 acres. The end of the prison was, where are all these flies coming from? Is there some food around here somewhere? There was a stockade wall coming across the top of this picture on the right, closing it off at 16 acres until the end of June. On July 1st, 1864, they added another 10 acres because the place was getting too crowded. The peak number of prisoners at Andersonville was just over 33,000. And that was on August 12th, 1864. About 2,000 of those were outside the stockade in the prison hospital. The rest, though, were all inside. And even with the 10 extra acres, you only had 26 acres in the prison, and probably, judging by the photographs here, 4 or 5 acres of that was uninhabitable. So say 21, 20 acres. That's, that's 1,200 men to the acre. That's quite a few men. That would be, on my home, that would be 24,000 men. I can't imagine that on my, I don't even like it when my wife invites more than one other couple. But 24,000 people is beyond my comprehension. I'm a little uncomfortable, in fact, with this many people in the tent. But the stockade commandant, Henry Wirz, was trying to get a little more room for everybody, and that was their effort to do that. Here's the fellow trenching his around his tent. You can see there's quite a wash there beside him, and there on the very right of the photograph, running up the right side, are the tops of the stockade logs. They look like they've been sawn off. I envisioned them having been chopped off with axes, but clearly they were sawn off, probably with buck saws. And those were the logs that would have been used to replace the rupture of August 9th. What else have we got? We have John Henry Winder. I didn't know how to pronounce this most of my life. I read Andersonville when I was about 15 years old, McKinley Cantor's Andersonville, not mine. And I always pronounced it Winder. Who wouldn't? Sort of like my mother pronounced the little square things in the side of the house. But it's Winder. He was a Marylander from not the Eastern Shore, but probably St. Charles County. Don't you love the little whiskers creeping out of his uniform there? That was a favorite style of whiskers in those days. If you ever seen a picture of John Dix, the Union general, he has that too. John Dix was born around 1798, I think, and this fellow was born around 1800. And apparently their generation thought it was kind of cool to look like you have a lot of chest hair, but it's really just whiskers from right here. Yeah, and you know, they shaved with straight razors in those days, and I know from shaving with a straight razor all my life, it's hard to get around the mouth. I mean, that's why I wear a beard for the most reason, but they chose to leave the easiest part to grow. He was a United States soldier most of his career. He was, when he turned 60, he was still a captain in the Quartermaster Corps. You didn't get a lot of rank fast in the Quartermaster Corps, but there was a lot of money to be exploited. And I don't know if he participated in it, but I know that others did, many did, including, what was his name, Bushrod Johnson, the Confederate general. When he was in the U.S. Army during the Mexican War, he tried to fudge some supplies, pretended that he signed on his honor that they were Army supplies, and that was the end of his Army career. Here is Winder again. This picture is taken at Andersonville by Riddle, presumably on August 16th. He's wearing colonel's stars on his collar. He doesn't have general's collar on, even though he's a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. But if you look at this other one, he doesn't have anything on his collar, it looks like. So that really doesn't, a lot of people I think mistook this photograph because they were set off by the colonel's stars. But there are paintings and photographs of Robert E. Lee wearing similar stars without the general's wreath around it. Looks a little more haggard now, and his whiskers have kind of crept up. This is his son, Sidney, who chose the prison site. Sidney was a quartermaster, and he sort of looks it, kind of a dandy. This is Richard Winder, and another quartermaster. He was the cousin of Sid. He was John Winder's nephew, and he built the prison. He was the one who impressed all the slave labor, had the logs cut, had the gates hung, and that sort of thing. And this fellow is Henry Wirz, a Swiss immigrant of German extraction. Not a great hero, but not the evil character that he has subsequently been depicted as. Although he did apparently abandon a family in Switzerland. I don't know if he intended to do that or if that just was the way things worked out. Came to the United States and later met another woman. I hear that happens these days now and then. And then he became a physician of sorts, studying with another homeopathic physician in Kentucky, and worked his way down the Mississippi to Louisiana, where he was working on a plantation as a doctor to slaves, essentially. And here he is, again, presumably August 16th at Andersonville. This is an A.J. Riddle photograph of him, somewhat touched up across this. I don't remember if it was a book or not, but about the time I was working on Andersonville, a fellow sent me these photographs, and they had Riddle's name on the back, and they appear to be a set. It was his misfortune to be assigned as the commandant of the stockade at Andersonville. He was not in charge of the whole post. There was another officer who would command the guards, and another who was in command of the post that encircled it all. Now, don't get the wrong idea about these fellows holding hands. That was not yet even respectable, let alone as popular as it is today. These fellows are brothers. And that was not uncommon for brothers or even friends to have pictures taken holding hands. Today it might be a little more difficult to get someone to do that, depending. The fellow on the right is Lorenzo Farnham, and the one on the left is Leandrew Farnham. I would have thought, in fact, I think I wrote it once as Leander because that's the name you think of, but you know, up in Vermont, they don't get a lot of contact with newspapers and books up in the kingdom there by the Canadian border. So they named him Leandrew, and well, he kept it. I mean, I guess what else would you do? They were in the 11th Vermont. The brother on the right, the corporal, was the younger one. I think he's in his late 20s. He enlisted first in the summer of 1862, and the 11th Vermont was later changed to the 1st Vermont Heavy Artillery. Those of you who know how that works during the Civil War, that was fairly safe duty. That was like being in the National Guard during the Vietnam War, at least if you weren't in the New Hampshire National Guard. The other brother, the older one, Leandrew, enlisted in December of 1863, probably on the advice of his brother, who said, "We've got a soft spot here. You can get the same bounty for enlisting in the heavy artillery as you do in the infantry, and you might get drafted anyway, which was true. He wasn't married. So even though he was near 40, he was wide open for the draft. So he enlisted, and they served together around Washington until the spring of 1864, when Grant began running out of infantry around Spotsylvania on his way to the North Anna, and he called down a lot of the heavy artillery from Washington, and the 11th Vermont came down as the 1st Vermont heavy artillery, but they ended up going into the front lines as infantry, and they were captured. Most of the regiment, I think, was captured on June 22nd, 1864, outside Petersburg. And they both ended up at Andersonville. This, believe it or not, is another picture of Leandrew Farnham. I found in researching the Riddle photographs, I found under the date of August 16th, 1864, the names of all the men who were buried that day. The Confederates kept good records of the men who died and where they were buried, so that they could be identified by their next of kin. It's not like they were burying them in mass graves and just piling them in and to hide them. And the trenches that they dug that day consisted of two. The first one they finished off in the middle of the day. The second one they began. And if you'll notice, this trench is a new trench. They've just begun it. There are two men lying in the trench, and there are two men picking up a body to toss in the trench as the third body. Well, that third body is Leandrew Farnham. He had died the day before. And there is his grave, number 5851. This is the same scene that you saw 2 slides ago, taken probably in 1991 or 2 by me. His brother didn't last much longer. He died a few days later. You'll notice, though, that his grave number is about 400 higher than his brother's. By that time of the summer of 1864, they were dying at about 100 a day on some days. This fellow was almost one of the ones who died. Charles Whitney from the 154th New York. He had been captured. I think he was captured at Chickamauga, so he would have been a prisoner about 6 months or more after before he went to Andersonville. And he began to develop scurvy, as many did after 6 or 7 months without vegetables or any kind of vitamin C nutrient. And scurvy helped to kill or killed probably a plurality of the prisoners at Andersonville. The cause of death might have been listed as dysentery or anything else, but scurvy, as the summer progressed, increasingly contributed to the deaths. This man, Lawson Carley, he's the first sergeant of in the 5th Ohio Cavalry. He was a monster. He was taller than Alan Gelzo. I think his descriptive list has him as 6'7", which is huge for 1862 when he enlisted. That's how he got to be first sergeant. He could crush anybody in the company. But the ironic thing about him is he proceeded to Andersonville with General Stoneman to try to liberate the prisoners. Stoneman and McCook led cavalry columns that were raiding around Atlanta, and Stoneman wanted to try to make the name for himself of liberating Andersonville, plus freeing, 30,000 prisoners, and many of whom could have gone back to duty. Unfortunately, Stoneman ended up a prisoner himself, as did most of his cavalry. They, at least his column of the cavalry, they ran into Georgia militia, which, believe it or not, stopped them. And then they turned around and ran back for their own lines and ran into Joe Wheeler's cavalry, who handled them even more harshly. And that's how Lawson Carley ended up at Andersonville. He was only there 5 or 6 weeks, but he lost a considerable amount of weight, probably because, like most of the cavalry captured from Stoneman, he was stripped of everything. His overcoat, his blankets, He was, he let back in with the clothes on his back. The guards did that because it was known around the prison that that cavalry had been raiding indiscriminately among the civilian population, stealing from families and burning houses, and so they retaliated against that specific set of prisoners. These are the photographs, I'll go through these and then come back, that you see associated with Andersonville a lot. There are probably 24, 25 of these skeletal photographs that are almost always depicted as prisoners from Andersonville. Most of them are not prisoners from Andersonville. Most of them are prisoners from Belle Isle who were released in June of 1864 by Confederate authorities and released without a demand for equivalence. In other words, they didn't require the Union forces to supply other Confederate prisoners in exchange for them. And they did that because obviously these fellows were probably not going to be able to serve on military duty again for a long time, and probably because they were bound to die if they stayed where they were, and it may well have been considered that it would be better if they died in Union hands than in Confederate. I don't know if that was the case. I found no documentary evidence of that, but that seems like a logical supposition. One or more of these photographs, one of these photographs may be from Andersonville, I'm not sure which, but take a look at this fellow here. All skin and bones. Look at his face. It looks like a skull. He can't lift his hands. He hasn't the strength to lift his hands. And the presumption was, when these photographs were taken, that these men were being starved deliberately by the Confederate authorities. And that's why the photographs were taken. They were taken for propaganda use. In June of '64, and later in December of '64 and January of '65, when there were some prisoners from Andersonville in this condition who made it back, these photographs were taken by the War Department and were reproduced as woodcuts in the illustrated newspapers, and the purpose of which was to engender hostility against the South, to infuriate the population, to inflame people who might have been flagging in their support for the war. I think I can probably tell you that there was that none of these men were starving from deliberate action by the Confederates. Obviously, Confederate rations were less than they were in the North, both in the Confederate Army and in Confederate prisons. But either army tended to treat its prisoners as it treated its own soldiers. That's why Confederate prisoners in Union hands tended to get the same rations that Union soldiers got in the field. Prison camp officials would deliver the same rations to the prisoners that the Confederate soldiers got. There were specific instances where rations were withheld, sometimes for as much as a day. Those were fairly rare. They were usually to enforce some sort of discipline within the prison, such as trying to recount the prisoners in order to order an adequate ration of prisoners, of food for the prisoners. The diaries that you read during the war, the original diaries, don't say much. They do say that the rations were thin. They don't say much about rations being withheld day after day. The memoirs, on the other hand, extensively accuse the Confederate authorities of withholding food from soldiers, but that's a different issue. Memoirs are, I tend to mistrust memoirs quite a bit. These men are probably suffering from, in most cases, dysentery or chronic diarrhea. The Joseph Barnes's Medical and Surgical History of the Rebellion has some 900, give or take 25, case histories of men who died in Union hands of chronic diarrhea, and dysentery. And the descriptions of the patients as they were dying depict these men. They're bone thin, their eyes are sunken, their cheeks are sunken, they can't lift their arms, they can't keep their heads up, they can't stand up on their own. And these were men dying in relative abundance. It didn't matter what you fed them, they didn't, unless it was the right thing, and who knew what the right thing was in 1864? I don't know that they do for sure today. But these men were dying in Union hands in the same way that they were dying in the South. So of course you would have some on either side. And there were there was at least one Confederate surgeon whose letters I found at the University of Georgia, who was incensed at the condition of Confederate prisoners sent back to Savannah toward the end of the war. And I'm sure that wasn't deliberate either, even though Union prison authorities did ultimately cut down the rations of Confederate prisoners in retaliation. These are Confederate prisoners, and pictures like this are often used as contrast to those I just showed you, as a means of arguing that essentially the Union authorities took very good care of Confederate prisoners. And certainly they did take better care of them, and they had better resources. But keep in mind, these men were captured just a couple of weeks before this photograph was taken. They were taken at Fort Donelson, and they still have all the clothing they had when they were captured. And the barracks that are behind them are at Camp Douglas, Illinois. They were provided for Union recruits. And a lot of recruiting stations like Camp Chase, early rendezvous for Union soldiers, became prison camps because it was handy. There were barracks there, and then other prisons like Elmira were expanded, and barracks were built specifically for but again, in the South, the Confederates took care of their prisoners about as they did their troops. Confederate troops did not generally rendezvous in barracks. In many cases, they probably felt they didn't need them, perhaps because of the weather. But toward the beginning of August 1864, they did start building some barracks at Andersonville, as they had been planning for some time. And their efforts were sometimes foiled by Union cavalry. One railroad shipment from Columbus was destroyed by Union cavalry. It contained carloads of nails and other construction supplies that were meant for Andersonville, shovels that were meant for sanitation around the latrines. That was one of Captain Wirz's bugbears, trying to take care of the latrines, and he had men out with shovels all the time trying to work on that. Consequently, they weren't able to build real barracks at Andersonville. They ended up building a couple of two-story platforms. I think there were 6 on one end, and then they started on the other end of the prison building others, and they got a roof on it. And that's about all. They didn't have enough nails to put boards up on the sides. And then when they finally had some supplies, they were getting rid of most of the prisoners. Once Sherman captured Atlanta, in early September, they started shipping the prisoners out to Savannah, and ultimately to the Camp Millen that was just discovered recently, the site of which was just discovered. Many of the men sent from Andersonville were released in November November and December, because they were sick again, and they couldn't be taken care of, and so they were sent north. This was one man who went north from Savannah in November of 1864. He was captured with the 2nd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery at Plymouth. His name was Frank Kennard. He spent 7 months at Andersonville, and he was diminutive. He was only 5'4" when he enlisted at the age of 19. I suspect that's because of malnutrition. He was from a very poor family, but he was kind of sturdy. He was 140 pounds at 5'4". That's kind of burly. but he said he shrank to 90 pounds at Andersonville. Not once did he suggest in his late application for a pension that he was deliberately starved. He said he was suffering from dysentery, and that it continued for 5 months after he was released. In fact, it continued until he was discharged in June of 1865 and continued into the fall of 1865, all the while he was in a land of plenty. I've thrown him in here because, well, I don't have any poltergeist stories related to Gettysburg, and thank God, but this comes the closest to something eerie. When I was working on Andersonville, I was always hoping I could find somebody from my hometown who was at Andersonville. Not that I wished that on anyone, but it just would have been kind of a nice connection, I thought. And I couldn't find anyone. Well, I knew this fellow had been in the 9th New Hampshire and had been discharged in March of '63 for, I think, hepatitis, what we would call hepatitis. But I didn't realize he had re-enlisted in Massachusetts, moved to Boston to work, and re-enlisted in Massachusetts and was captured. So here was my Conway soldier in Andersonville. The ironic thing about it is that the house he lived in is about as far as from here to that other tent from where my house is. I live on the same land that he did. So we're sort of brothers of the soil. Many others did not make it, and this was the cemetery at the end of the war. There were nearly 13,000 soldiers buried there out of, I calculate, about 41,000 individuals who went to Andersonville. This was before Clara Barton and the Quartermaster Corps came to Andersonville. And this is Henry Wirz being hanged at the end of the war. It became necessary to associate, at least in the minds of radical Republicans, to associate the South with something as reprehensible as the deliberate attrition of Union prisoners. And the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, not one of my favorite people, and a number of others bent their every energy to make sure that this man was convicted for war crimes against Union prisoners, the purpose being to divide the Democratic Party from reuniting between North and South. The Democrats had dominated American politics between 1828 and 1860, and radical Republicans, either for altruistic motives or their own selfish political motives, were desperate for that not to happen again, and it therefore was useful to use Andersonville to drive a wedge between the sections and to further the aims of radical Republicans. And if you favor those, perhaps that was the better thing to do, but was it necessary? I doubt. This is the stockade falling down in 1868, the outer stockade, and this is what's left, basically, the cemetery. The last prisoners are buried in the back. So there you have what was at the end of the road to Andersonville, 13,000 more dead, and a great deal more animosity that lasted for years after the war. Thank you very much. I think I have maybe 2 or 3 minutes. I thank you for letting me go early. Do I still get paid? Oh, go ahead.
Were the conditions at Union POW camps equally poor?
Generally, no. No, as I say, the northern prisons were reflected the resources of the North. Most Confederate prisoners had shelter, for one thing. And even after Union authorities reduced the rations of Confederate prisoners in retaliation, they still had more food than the Southerners did. The point is that there was no deliberate, concerted effort to ruin the health of Union prisoners. Yes, ma'am.
What were the specific charges against Henry Wirz?
Oh, they were numerous. They included not only murdering Union prisoners. There were several obviously fictitious stories told on the witness stand of him shooting and beating people to death. This is a man who had a chronically injured right arm with an open wound on it, and an atrophied deltoid muscle, probably from a torn rotator cuff in his left arm, who couldn't probably beat a cat sufficiently to reprimand it. And at the very end, I think he was charged also with conspiring with the Confederate authorities in all of this. And perhaps they threw in as well the charge of associating with the attempt to assassinate Lincoln, because that was another thing that they tried to fix on Confederate authorities after the war, again to try to, I think, to continue the animosity of the war period. Steve, I think you...
Professor Guelzo spoke on Spielberg's Lincoln and Glory. Will you give us, Bill, a good point and a bad point from Ted Turner's Andersonville?
Well, the bad point,
The good point.
the good point, that's the hard one. I can't think of one. The worst of it was that he followed McKinley Cantor. He should have followed me, but unfortunately my book came out just as his movie came out. I did make about 13 grand off the lawsuit, though that people sued him for copyright infringement. They said they came up with a screenplay just like that, and the attorneys used me as an expert witness to say that anyone would have who was writing about Andersonville. They were all the standard sources that they used, and that's what he did. Unfortunately, he used the sources that were popular at the time, and as late as 1990, the sources that were popular at the time were John Ransom's diary, which he didn't write during the war. It was a post-war production that he wrote mainly to get his own pension, and then John McElroy's Andersonville, which was also sensationalized for sale, and it was it badly exaggerated. Not the conditions at Andersonville, although it did exaggerate them somewhat, but the motives for the reasons for the suffering there. I'm still trying to think of a good thing about Andersonville. I mean, here you've got guys in the movie. They're wringing their blue woolen uniforms out after a rainstorm to get drinking water, when right behind them there were tents. They could have just put their pots under the edge of the tent and caught the fresh water. It was sort of like Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. Tom wants to saw the leg off Jim's bed so he can escape, and Jim says, "Well, why don't you just lift the leg up and pull that chain out?" I didn't care for. I gave Andersonville a very bad review in Civil War Times, and that's why I was chosen for by the lawyer. All done? All right. Thank you very much.